Software Engineering Radio, episode 94, Open Source Business Models with Dirk Riehle. This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers, on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio brings you relevant and detailed discussions and interviews on software engineering topics every 10 days. Thanks to our audience and the partners listed on our website for supporting the podcast. Welcome everybody, here is another episode of SE Radio, your favorite software engineering podcast. This episode is a little bit less technical than some of the others we've had. This episode is on how you can make money with open source, more or less. Don't forget that this is the third episode in which we have the little advertising at the end from OSE. They're still looking, I presume they're still looking for new colleagues. So if you speak German, you should listen to it. Otherwise, skip it. And please let us know what you think about this kind of advertisement. Okay, so let's get on with the show. Here is the episode I recorded in Santa Clara when I was at EclipseCon with Dirk. Have fun. So we're talking to Dirk Riehle today. Some of you German-speaking listeners probably know him from the Golf book, which he translated. So welcome, Dirk.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Marcus.
Sure, pleasure. So what are you up to today?
I live in the Silicon Valley. I work for SAP Labs and in particular SAP Research, where I lead the open source research group. So I mostly deal with open source professionally these days. Not so much doing open source, but research into it. How could SAP benefit? How do companies benefit from open source?
So by that time, you probably guessed what this show is going to be about. It's also listed in the title, so you probably know anyway. It's about open source, professional open source, the business models and the philosophies behind it. And Dirk is obviously a good person to speak to. To get us started, in theory, open source is about making the world better, right? You have this idea of doing something for free and giving it away for free, and everybody can see what you do. So there is this whole philosophy of improving the state of the universe. Mm-hmm. How does this go together with this professional/business open source kind of thing?
So I think in theory and in practice, open source is for some about improving the world. That is certainly true, and that's not to be neglected. But also, as you say, it's about commercial interests these days. So we have both. We have volunteers, we have the people who just like to code, and we have clear commercial interests on open source. And there are various business models on how you can make money off open source. There are probably as many business models as there are companies.
Yeah. So is it exclusive, or is it either commercial, let's say as an example, Spring Source, or completely voluntary, or is there also a way of mixing it? What's the role of the voluntaries in a professional environment, maybe?
Yeah, no, volunteers are always individual people. So it's like someone who likes to program and who would wants to contribute, they just do that. The commercial players are, of course, companies. So it's a legal entity that has a commercial interest. And so we see how commercial companies sponsor, create, or contribute to open source projects for different purposes. For example, because they believe open source gets them faster adoption of their product.
Yeah. Okay, so just to set the stage, in this episode, we're going to talk about professional open source, about the business models. So we don't talk about the, let's say, philosophy of this other thing mainly. So let's first start with looking at certain existing open source business models. I guess the obvious one for me, at least, because I'm involved in one. I'm involved in this open architecture stuff, and my business is consulting for this thing. So that's probably one way to do it.
Yes, that's certainly one. The way we look at it from a research perspective is that we recognize open source as a tool to get you somewhere with your business model and your business and how to create a revenue stream. And this tool has three main effects that you utilize in your business model. So, for example, the most well-known is open sourcing in order to get speedier adoption in the market. And based on that, for example, companies have built the dual license strategy, most notably MySQL, but other companies as well.
So what is a dual license strategy?
The dual license strategy is a strategy where the legal entity, the company, owns the code. It's not the volunteers who contribute, because there are no volunteers. It's it's people paid by the company, and hence the company owns the copyright. And thus, the company goes to market with the open source, with the product, the database in the case of MySQL.
Right.
And all they effectively do is they provide the source code, and people pick up on it and possibly improve it, but that never makes it back into the product, unless the contributor gives back to MySQL the rights to the code, so gives up their copyright. So MySQL tightly controls the copyright. It's their product, and what they do then is they give it away for free under a GPL license, and they sell services or sell rights to usage based on a different license, a proprietary license, their own license to commercial customers who, for example, want to build applications based on MySQL, MySQL.
So in that case, open source is often associated with this FLOSS thing, free open source software, right? So in this case, the most important aspect is probably the free part, because it's not like you can easily contribute.
So the reason why there are two licenses is it is free to use under the GPL license, and maybe we need to explain how that works.
We have a section on licenses later also.
Okay, so basically what the GPL lets you do is you can use it, but if you want to use it commercially, if you don't have just a private use, if you have a commercial use, you would have to provide your source code to whoever is interested. And that's, of course, not what a commercial company using MySQL would like to do. So basically, using the GPL license, the product makes it into companies, gets used for free, but if something more is built around, then the using company typically turns around and wants a commercial license with proper support of the product.
Okay, so this professional license then relieves you from the requirement to also open source your own product, and it gives you probably a support contract with all the bells and whistles that you would expect.
Yes, it has different users for the buying company, but if it's just a user, it's obviously the support and services, the subscription model, the place to call, the guaranteed 24-hour support if something goes wrong.
So this professional support thing, is this only legally possible? So let's say I'm the company, I develop the system, I make it available on the GPL, people can use it, and I also do this other license with the professional support. Now assume it's different. Assume the system is really developed by this open source community with people from different companies and volunteers, right? And the product is really open source. You can use it professionally without, this licensing thing. It's probably then not GPL. Can a company still come in and say, we provide professional support and support contracts and stuff for such a licensed thing?
Yes, absolutely. Let me first clarify two terms which I think are important.
Right.
We distinguish between community open source and commercial open source. And community open source is a project or a source code that is shared by a community where there is no single legal entity that controls it. Commercial open source then is the situation like MySQL, Sugar CRM, where a single company controls it and can give out different licenses. Now, services around community open source projects are definitely possible. Everyone is allowed basically to enter this market because nobody stops them. The issue, though, is that because the project or the product, the source code is really shared and there are no barriers to entry, the kind of revenue you can generate from that market is hard to get. So let's assume there is a lot of demand, then there will be lots of companies. If there is little demand, then lots of companies will leave the market. So basically your pricing from a service perspective, your services pricing is pretty much markup over cost. So it's not some high price you set because you're the 800-pound gorilla, but rather it's in strong competition with others.
Yeah, sure. But what you could do, for example, is 24 hours support if if the bug is found. I guarantee, because my company happens to host 2 or 3 committers, that we fix it and give you a new build within, so there could be this additional value.
This is definitely a business model, and we do see that. There was a recent IDC study, though, that suggested that these types of services, which are focused on a single open source project, that these types of services are actually not that much sought after.
Right. Okay.
So it was quite amazing for me too, because I believe this business model worked reasonably well. I didn't think it was a great business to be in, but I thought it would work. But this IDC study found that individual components, individual projects did not have much attendant services. This is to be distinguished from like Red Hat and all that, which basically are about the configuration or a larger stack. But just services, if you're focused on exactly one, you're a small
Tomcat,
company,
for example.
Exactly. That is a hard business, and apparently customers are not buying as much as one would expect.
Okay, so let's look at the next possible way of doing it. So what came to my mind is the gentleware thing, where there is this open source tool, AlgoUML, and they basically took over the code base and added additional features, made it more usable, made it more whatever, reliable something, and then sold that as a commercial product.
Yeah, that is definitely something we're seeing in the market too. Basically taking a community project, which has to be a community open source project typically, and then providing proprietary add-ons. That is possible if the license permits these add-ons in such a way that you don't have to open source them. Because if you would have to open source them too, you would not be able to build a positional advantage around your additions. Gentleware is one example. The big one that I'm using is Enterprise DB and PostgreSQL. So PostgreSQL is another database competing with MySQL. These are the 2 open source databases, and they're exactly complementary models. Meaning PostgreSQL has a very permissive license, and Enterprise DB employs several of the committers which contribute to the core project, so the overall user community is benefiting. But then Enterprise DB, as you illustrated in the Gentleware example too, builds additional adds-on, gives PostgreSQL additional enterprise strength, as they say. And that is a good business to be in, because you can really build your own advantage, and it's pretty close to traditional proprietary closed source models, because it's closed source that makes your competitive advantage.
Another example comes to my mind is the Eclipse Foundation, where a bunch of companies go to get together, make certain, let's say, base technologies open source, and as I heard this week on the conference, on EclipseCon, that's why I'm here, make sure that the code on Eclipse is actually not that great, so that the contributing companies have a way of building products on top of it. I'm not sure if it was meant completely in earnest, but...
I would not advise to do that, and the reason is that people are simply not stupid. So, I mean, to force them into something like this will only raise bad blood. But Eclipse is a really interesting example. As I said initially, open source is a tool to give you 3 key effects we see, one of which was speedier adoption. That's what MySQL and PostgreSQL are doing, and some others as well. The Eclipse platform and IBM's interests behind Eclipse are, in my opinion, a different effect they are playing off on, and that is to shift revenue between markets, meaning to shift revenue from a market that is actually not very attractive, or that you cannot really address because someone
development tools.
Exactly, because someone is keeping it occupied, or it's a really hard time. They had a really hard time with Visual Age competing against Visual Studio. To shift it into a place where you have a better position to work off. So what IBM does is the Eclipse platform draws many companies together. It's a real platform, and of course they're selling the Rational tool suite. It's true that they have, of course, the conflicts you talked about. So, for example, IBM also is still selling clear case. And so I always wondered why the support for CVS is great and not so much for Subversion in the standard Eclipse Java tools, for example, or in general. But what IBM really does is it's commoditizing the basic tools platforms and shifting and thereby enabling themselves basically to provide better tools on without having a reduced cost on the platform.
And another example of that is in the modeling space, Eclipse modeling, where there's a whole bunch of existing projects on Eclipse, and then, for example, Borland comes in, takes these things, provides a bunch of nice GUIs around it, and ships it as together. What is it, 2008 or something?
It's. I would like to add that I used, because you pointed to Eclipse, I used this as an example for shifting revenues between markets. All of these business models are sometimes taking different bits and pieces together. So to make my point about shifting revenues between markets, a clearer or cleaner example is, for example, is IBM's support of Linux. So directed mostly against Windows, of course, by trying to commoditize or by trying to keep down the amount of money that Microsoft can charge for Windows, because Linux is becoming a stronger competitor. The money available at a customer the money is split differently, so less goes to the operating system, license revenue, and into some other places.
Another way of looking at that is probably that if let's say Oracle supports Linux, then people can buy, don't have to spend as much license fees for whatever, Solaris or Windows, and then, as you say, will probably be willing to spend more on the database.
Yeah, exactly. If you only looked at the software part of the total IT stack or so, literally every company that has a stronghold on one component would like to be all other components to be available for free, because then it can charge most for its own component. IBM, again, is particularly interesting because so an example is IBM sponsoring Linux. Oracle, of course, would like the operating system to be free. SAP definitely would love to be all databases and all operating systems to be free, etc. IBM is a particularly interesting case because they can run circles around literally everyone, and that's because they are strong not just in software, but in services and hardware as well, in particular services. So services companies, for example, would love to have more or less all software for free, because all of the revenue, all of the customers' money would become services revenue, implementation services, configuration services, etc.
Which goes back to the original business model we had, which is providing professional services for open source products.
Yeah, that's true.
So closing the circle. The problem is we didn't finish yet, so we have to open the circle again because it seems there are more. One thing that I wrote down here is commercial hosting services for open source products. Like, for example, if you have the Tomcat server and I provide, a server farm where people can run their web app on on the Tomcat. Is that another thing that's interesting in this space, or is this too far removed from the fact that it's an open source product?
It is an interesting question. We haven't looked much into it because it would seem like another cutthroat business, because standard open source software, everyone can do it. Everyone can open a hosting service. I think so what I see is living here in the Valley, talking with lots of startups, looking at how they try to get by on a shoestring, is they have almost all standardized, more or less standard architectures, open source stacks underlying their web app. LAMP and LAP and Postgres. PostgreSQL is actually
LAPP.
So PostgreSQL is actually quite a strong database that's used by many. So these stacks look quite similar. And so I can see how a service can be standardized on that, and how this would open up a large customer base because they're used to these types of software. But then again, it sounds a bit like markup over cost pricing. Usually not. If you're coming from this, that's the situation you have in many industries. But of course, you would like to be able to charge prices that are better than just starting with your costs.
Right. any other business models when we prepared the questions here, didn't think of?
There are other business models. For example, you can provide a fair amount of consulting around open source. There's like here in the Valley a small boutique, but fairly well going one is the Alliance Group. You have some larger ones like OpenLogic. This to me feels more like a traditional consultancy. So their competence or their competitive advantage comes simply from having good people, from knowing how their consulting processes work, from being good at sales and customer acquisition.
Yeah.
And they just choose open source as the subject, but it could be probably any other subject too.
So is it also like for them a way of marketing to say is open source such a big topic today that putting it into your strategy and saying we provide training or consulting, especially for open source products, is that like a brand? Like maybe it's not Microsoft stuff. We do open source. I don't know. So
no, it's just a domain where you can provide consulting service, intellectual services around that. It's definitely a good bet these days. We just published a paper about the growth of open source, and we found that the open source code base is growing exponentially, and the number of viable active open source projects is also growing exponentially. Quite important for SAP to realize that, since it means, or it implied in this case, that open source is growing into more and more application domains, including business applications.
Right. Yeah.
And that you need to hold against that closed source in the packaged applications space is certainly not growing exponentially. So literally open source is eating into closed source. And for that, the question is on what base then, of course. So it's one thing to say it's growing exponentially, but then is it on a significant level already?
Yeah.
That's hard to measure. If you look at the pure revenues of open source applications in the packaged application market, it's at 0.7%. So it's below 1%.
Whoa.
Which I think is actually non-trivial already. I mean, you get different reactions, but this is really the nominal value. Now you need to add that on one download, there is maybe on 10 downloads, there's one paying user, and then what they actually pay is compared to traditional closed source, typically much cheaper. So doing different calculations, we can go up to like 27% of the packaged application market consisting of open source software packages.
So that sounds much better.
That sounds like a good consulting space to be in if there are not many consulting companies.
Although I would never start a company doing consulting for open source, right? I mean, I do consulting for, web frameworks in the open source space, or model-driven frameworks in the open source space. So just saying open source consulting for me seems to be too unspecific, but I might be wrong.
I think you're making a good point, because those companies that we observe that try to provide more strategic consulting still do this on a fairly general level, which means maybe the market is, obviously the market is still developing, but I'm pretty sure you're right that this is where it's going, that companies will differentiate and build expertise on specific domains.
I guess also there is a difference whether you do technical consulting for certain products, or whether, as you said, you do strategic consulting on the role of open source systems in an enterprise, blah, blah, blah. So let's talk a little bit about the chances and risks of working in this space or doing something here. So what do companies gain by open sourcing assets they have? And maybe which assets should you open source?
Well, let me start by a negative example. You should not open source something where you just want to get rid of it, because that's not how it works. I get approached frequently, how do I open source? And I ask, why do you want to open source? And, well, we got our resources cut and we don't want to let it die, but really don't have any time to spend on it.
So that's the idea of let the rest of the world maintain it.
Yeah, give it to the community and expecting the community will just pick it up and be grateful. And of course, that's not how it works. If you open source, you need to invest additional resources to help grow and build that community in the first place. So when you open source, what you should do, you should really have a strategic goal associated with that,
such as
open sourcing. Such as again, these three examples that I mentioned, you want to shift revenues between markets. You want to speed up adoption by giving it away for free in quotation marks. And the third one I didn't talk about yet, by creating a superior product, by working intensely with a community that it's basically user innovation, and it's it's an advanced form, interesting from a research perspective, an advanced form of product management, in my opinion. So
there is maybe one other one that comes to my mind in a very specific niche, and that is if you do security software, just let everybody look into it and see there is no backdoor, this kind of stuff. That could be an argument in that space. Okay, so again, you should, if you open source something, then don't do it just to get rid of the work. Do it because you have those goals and you have to invest, at least initially, to get the thing started. So I guess building a community is probably the key to it. So to build a community, what you do is you create a website and let it go. Of course not. So any ideas about what it takes to build a community? That's probably a separate topic, but just a couple of pointers.
This is a long and very interesting topic because that is something everyone has to get right if they want to create a successful open source project. I can tell you from our own experiences at SAP, we have an internal software forge which is not visible to the outside, but which is open to everyone. So we do see these open source effects. And it's a sequence of steps that basically need to be supported or enabled by software and by the behavior of people. And that is, first of all, the project literally needs to be findable. So if it's on some random server at some random URL, you won't find it. So be on SourceForge or be at a visible place, put your stuff on Freshmeat or Olo, and just make sure that you can be found. Now, you need those initial peoples who make it useful to users, of course, but what they want to do in building that community is draw volunteers. So in order to draw volunteers, you need to be open and transparent in your work. People need to be able to read up on what's going on. And you need to make the entrance hurdle for initial contribution as small as possible, as simple as hitting the reply button in a forum.
So I guess also the code needs to be documented, needs to be accessible, understandable.
Exactly. But I think most people evolve from being users to becoming developers to becoming committers. So I don't think people jump right into the code. I'm sure there are some who jump right into the code, but most start out as a user, do some testing and or answer questions or ask questions in a forum. So you incrementally draw them in.
So again, let's assume I open source something for one of those strategic reasons we talked about before. Of course, there is the risk that my competitors pick up this thing and improve their own, maybe commercial products. And so I give mine away and the others improve theirs and make more money. Is that a problem?
It is if you're not smart about it, but it's actually fairly easy to handle. And that's because we need to go back to this distinction between communities open source and commercial open source. Community open source, the rights, the copyright is spread around a community, and there's then only one license that regulates things. And commercial open source, a single legal entity owns it. And so if you provide a product to the outside world under a community license, then what you just as community open source and under a permissive license, so it always goes together, then yes, you can be ripped off. But now you need to look at your strategic goal. Community open source and permissive license, you use that typically when you want to shift revenues between markets. So you want to not necessarily kill the initial market, but just reduce the impact. Now for commercial open source, you use a dual license strategy or something similar. So you are actually maintaining the full rights to the software and are positioning yourself as squarely in the center of the community. So you are the obvious go-to person. The software bears your name. You own the website, which is naturally pointed to by that name. And so while some competitor can use GPL-based code, they'll just be in a much, much weaker position than you to provide services.
Okay. But I mean, they can still take a look at the code and just learn how to do things and then build a commercial product that picks up those patterns. Okay,
Yeah, that's definitely possible.
Yeah.
But you need to see the company that wants to earn its livelihood by open sourcing a commercial open source product. It doesn't stand still. I'm not sure it's a winner takes all game, but it very much looks like that. You need to build that community. You need to get that speedy adoption going. You need to get those smart people in the community to tell you what are the right features and thus be implementing the right features best for your customers. And then, sure, let someone else try to steal from you, but what's their competitive advantage over you? They'll always be a step behind.
Yeah, and probably their tool might be more expensive since it is not open source. Maybe it's a commercial product, so why should others buy it? So I don't know.
Exactly. Maybe it's commercial, but even if they are cheaper because they really are in a cheap loan country,
Whatever,
it's still it's not likely to be the best product or the best project because the originator has the speed, has the momentum.
Right. Okay, so before we talk about the licenses, sometimes when I hear about these kinds of business models around it, it sounds like there's an exit strategy which basically says, I mean, obviously Red Hat with JBoss, and also, I mean, I think it's a question of time until one of the big guys buys Spring Source, right? I mean, that's obvious where they're going.
Yeah.
So, is this a valid idea? Exit strategy to be bought up?
Yeah, exit strategy is a term for startups, typically, what happens. And I think open source is just a business model. It's not clear to me that it implies, I haven't really thought about it in much detail. It's not clear to me that it implies a specific exit strategy. I think it's open to any startup, whether it uses an open source approach, go-to-market approach or not, to go the usual ways, meaning get bought, the typical thing. Well, the typical thing is go broke, but get bought or possibly IPO and make it on their own. So I think these are all options. I can imagine that you clearly are a public open source company, Red Hat in some senses.
Yeah. Next big topic, licenses.
All right.
So why don't we start by you giving us a brief overview of the most well-known, most important open source licenses, and maybe, why they are different and how they are different and these kinds of things.
Okay, I absolutely have to say the to be expected thing. I am not a lawyer, so none of this is legal advice. Yeah. But quite honestly, even for someone who deals with open source on a daily basis, it's easily confusing.
Right.
So, but let me give it a try, and maybe you bring in a lawyer, a real license expert at some other point of time. Okay. The key differentiator is, of course, between a permissive license and a viral license or reciprocal license. A permissive license, like the BSD licenses or Apache license, they allow everyone to take the code, modify it, and distribute it without having to open source the modifications. That's the key part. So while you take something in, you are not constrained to private use. Even if you have a commercial use, you do not need to provide code back to a community. And quite frankly, while that may sound like stealing to some, it really isn't that bad, simply because if you make modifications for yourself, then you are creating your own maintenance burden.
Right.
So most companies will think twice whether permissive or not, whether to contribute back or not. Now, the reciprocal license, most notably the GPL, but I also would like to mention the Affero Gpl. So because it was in the press recently, I'll come to that maybe in a second. The GPL requires that for non-private users, like commercial users, basically anything that implies distribution of code, that you have to open source your modifications to the code provided to anyone who comes asking. And that, of course, is the reciprocal or sometimes called viral nature of the GPL.
Viral because it infects the other software also to be open source. Yeah.
Once you contribute, whatever you do, it's sucked in and it spreads to your contribution. And I'm not sure viral is the right term.
Right.
The point is really just they wanted to make sure that if you're benefiting, then you should be giving back. And the interesting thing, of course, is that the dual license strategy is built around the GPL, and the GPL is with like something like 70% the most dominant license, but for two very different reasons. For the philosophical reasons of this sharing and giving back on the one hand, and for the very capitalistic reason of stalling your competitor from ripping off your code base in the dual license strategy. So it's both very socialist and very capitalist at the same time. Isn't that a nice dichotomy?
There is also the Lgpl license, which stands for, I think, lesser GPL. Does it mean it's less strict about having to open source your own thing?
Yes, so the original intent of the Lgpl, and back then it was still called the library GPL, was to let you use Lgpl code in your system without having to provide the source code of your system if you don't actually change that source code. So that's why it's a library. It's you link the library. This all gets very quickly, very tricky. It all depends on the definition of what is derived code, how does code link with each other. I mean, it's very obvious if you modify an original file that you modified an original file, but what about static linking? What about dynamic linking? What about web services calls? What kind of connection between two pieces of code does that establish, and when does your code fall under the license of that used code and when not?
Another example in that space could be if I use a GPL open source piece of code during construction of my own system, code generator or an IDE. Does that make my own code? I mean, I'm not including it in the product. It's not there at runtime, but I include it in the production of my system. It's probably more to the side of not using, right? So it's probably relatively safe.
I think it's safe. Just imagine the GCC. So you compile code, that's fine. But it gets tricky or iffy pretty quickly. What about the generated code? Depends on some libraries and only runs with some libraries, and then those are under perhaps GPL. So it's sometimes very tricky for commercial software vendors.
Since we talked about Eclipse before, is there anything notable about the Eclipse public license EPL?
It's a by and large permissive license. I am actually not that much involved with Eclipse. While I work for SAP and SAP is involved with Eclipse, we are both contributing and actually leading Eclipse components these days. We're very proud of that achievement. What comes to my mind that needs to be thought about by anyone venturing in the space is, of course, the issue of patents, is the issue of how do you regulate that. You can always put a patent, you can implement source code that infringes on someone's patents. More professional, I kind of consider them kind of second generation licenses, like the Eclipse license tries to deal with it, tries to regulate it through the contributor agreement. So the Apache Software Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, they all require that anyone who contributes code sign an agreement. I honestly don't actually know whether this really completely deals with patents or not. I actually think it doesn't.
So I don't know either, but what I heard they have is this very fancy piece of software which goes through code that's contributed and tries to find patent infringements or something, or copyright infringements. So I don't know if this is a rumor or whether these kinds of systems really exist. But I know that they are very strict about the IP process, as they call it.
I can imagine. I don't know about how they could find out about patent violations. I can imagine that they use something like Black Duck's software, which checks code for whether it has been copied and pasted from other code. So, for example, so that by way of copy and paste, GPL code suddenly gets submitted.
So it knows all the GPL code?
Black Duck software? IP Central, I think, is the product. They literally they download all the open source projects. They classify them by license. I think they call it genetic fingerprinting of code. And then companies can use that, or Eclipse Foundation could use it. I don't know whether they're using it to match up code contributions, whether they have possibly been derived from open source projects that may not be compatible by license.
I guess building such a product would be another open source business model.
I thought about it earlier, but their software is clearly proprietary and does come at its price point. You're right. Open source opens up many opportunities.
Yeah.
Can I mention the Affero Gpl?
Of course. So I never read about it. But
it's not as well known maybe as it should be, because it's a really interesting development. The GPL version 2, which is probably still the dominant license, was conceived at a point of time where software as a service was not a big thing, or like 91, I believe. So it was always a big issue. Does providing a web service through the net, does that commercial web service, does that constitute distribution of code? Should require building such a service that you open source your code if you build on GPL code.
So if my web service uses GPL code,
like a LAMP stack. So if you build on the LAMP stack, or you modify, or you use MySQL, maybe you even modify it, but you really just use it. You don't provide copies of your MySQL code. You just run it on your servers. Then the GPL version 2, in my understanding, would not require you to open source your MySQL modifications. And then came along the GPL version 3, and everyone hoped it would fix that so-called ASP loophole. Maybe more SaaS or SaaS loophole these days.
Software as a service.
Exactly. And it didn't. And it's unclear why, in my opinion. I'm not enough involved in that. So basically, people found a workaround, and that is the Affero Gpl, also in version 3, which, as you said, is pretty unknown. But that license requires that if you make modifications to MySQL and run a web service of it, then if MySQL was under Affero Gpl, which it probably never will be, but if it was, then you would have to provide your modifications. And what's noteworthy is the Affero Gpl has recently become OSI approved license. So it's one of the, I'm not sure where they are right now, maybe 100 current open source initiative approved licenses, like the GPL.
You say there are 100 open source licenses?
This is embarrassing. I really should know whether it's 50 or 100.
Okay.
Look it up.
I thought there are like 5.
opensource.org. No. There's any number of variations.
Okay.
And there are many licensees that try to be as open source as they can without actually giving you the full rights of open source, meaning you have the right to get the source code, modify it, redistribute your modifications.
So I guess one recommendation to companies or individuals who want to open source something is probably then not to invent their own license, but rather to take an existing one because it's kind of legally proven, right?
Yeah. So it's certainly advisable not to do your own thing.
Yeah.
And you can pick one from those approved by the OSI. It's not exactly legal. The OSI is a non-profit organization founded by Eric Raymond and Bruce Perens, I believe. And so it's kind of an by de facto non-profit that approves licenses. I don't think there's a notion of legal license or illegal license.
No, that's not what I meant. I meant it's if I come up with a license, I have to make sure that the actual legal wording in it actually enforces what I want it to enforce.
Oh, right.
So existing licenses are proven in the sense that everybody knows what they mean, and there have maybe been even court cases about it. It's like reinventing your own encryption algorithm. Yeah. Same stupid idea, I think.
Yeah, that's of course true. I mean, if you're sitting at home, you're a one-person open source project, before you get into legalese, it's definitely better to adopt a license that has been vetted by lawyers.
Right, yeah. So since we were talking about this professional open source thing and the business relationship, are there any of those licenses that are better for for making money with open source software, or does it really depend on what you want to do?
It clearly depends on what you want to do. It's a sequence of steps, which is like, what is the main effect you want to cause in the market?
Mm-hmm.
How does that define your revenue stream? Then if open source is the tool that lets you do that, like shift revenues between markets, then you need to look at what's the right license in that specific context.
Mm-hmm.
So again, for shifting revenue between markets, it's typically a permissive license because you actually want to more or less reduce the revenue in a specific market. So you want as many people to come in as possible. So you don't make it easy. You lower the barriers to entering services around such a component as much as you can. And for others, it's others. So the GPL again for the dual license strategy, that's the big sledgehammer to keep your competitors in check and stop them from ripping off your work.
So let's look at a couple of specific interesting points here. So the first one we jotted down here was that if you look at professional open source, then most of that stuff is with really big companies like Oracle or IBM, obviously with Eclipse. So is this professional open source thing only for the big guys, or is it? Do you know of examples that where smaller companies are involved? Well, MySQL could be an example, maybe.
Yeah. So I think the term professional open source that you're using, maybe it derives from kind of more professional services around it.
Maybe, yeah.
So that typically suggests you have a working consulting services operation, which suggests you're talking about larger companies. When MySQL, of course, provides services around its product. Yeah, I'd call them commercial because I think that's the term that Sugar CRM came up with.
Yep.
I guess professional and commercial means the same here.
Yeah, I guess so.
I think it's open to everyone, but I would be repeating myself.
Sure.
So if you're really providing professional services around just one component, it's a tough market. If you are a large company and you're providing services around many components, that's a different thing because you're integrating them already. So Red Hat is not providing services around just one specific open source, but their added value is really in the certified stack and services around that. But it's tricky. So for example, SpikeSource tries to provide configurable stacks that depending on their customer needs, and I don't know where they stand right now. Their business seems to be hard.
Do you think this whole Web 2.0 thing, contribution by everybody, collaboration, blah blah blah, is that a major driver for open source because it has this read-write web, as I think Lessig once called it? Do you think there is a connection between open source and Web 2.0?
I think there is, and in at least two ways, one of which you just mentioned, the kind of mindset of philosophy, the methods and processes that they use, and of course, plain and simple technically, that that everyone can set up a web service in their basement, just get a LAMP or lab stack and put the software into service. The more interesting one, though, is what you just pointed out, the kind of approach. We actually call it, at SAP, I had to find a way how to make my two work topics, wikis and open source, fit together. So I called it open collaboration. It is an approach to collaboration between people where you have no single CEO who can put the thumb on you and kind of direct you what to do, but rather, as we see, for example, in the case of Wikipedia, this type of collaboration is egalitarian, meaning everyone can contribute. You're open to outside contributions. You market your project as opposed to you hide what you're doing. It's meritocratic, meaning you really value what's being contributed based on the value and not by who is saying it. And it's self-organizing. Typically, open source processes and Wikipedia and wikis choose open source projects, and Wikipedia define their own process. So every project is different. We do research into open source processes. It turns out there is no single open source process. They're all different. So we had to look at more individual practices, but that's a different topic.
So if I want to start my own business
Mhm.
in the context of this open source stuff,
Mhm.
can I get VC money? Or I don't know, or
Yeah.
is VC only about really hyped, colorful end users,
Well,
Are there examples of
Yeah.
VC money around open source systems? or
Oh,
products?
absolutely. But the good news is there is a lot of money around open source companies and business models.
Mhm.
The bad news is the train has left the platform, meaning examples of MySQL was venture capital funded.
Okay.
Uh,
Spring Source just got 10 millions.
Enterprise DB is at like 150 million, I believe. And so that's based on PostgreSQL, Alfresco. There are lots of commercial open source startups now. I recently talked with one venture capitalist, and I've heard that story before, is they themselves sat down, looked at the different markets, looked at in which market open source could be a strategic tool, a disruptive tool, a tool to disrupt the market, and actively sought out entrepreneurs to start open source companies on providing gardening supply software, something.
And would that be community open source or the other one?
I'm pretty sure they most certainly looked at commercial open source because the profit margins of commercial open source, while not quite back to the good old heydays of closed source software, are better than services revenue.
So getting VC money for your consulting company around Tomcat probably won't work.
No, I don't. Consulting companies, I cannot imagine that they get funding.
Yeah.
But my point is, the VCs have already thinly combed through the market, and so you have to have more than just open source in your business model in order to get VC funding these days. You have to either unique intellectual property or connections, distribution channels, specific people's things that could differentiate you.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's true for any VC funding anyway. So
yeah. But the point being that open source really just doesn't pull it through, and it's not the main thing any longer. So if that's the first thing on your slide deck, that's not a good thing to do.
It's like in the book market, just having the word pattern on the title doesn't make it the
That's
sales.
long over too, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, it's maybe different.
Oh, maybe for better, sure.
Yeah.
Things move on.
Yeah. So we only hear about successful open source companies. I think you said before that the default case is that you go bankrupt. So are there any failed open source efforts? And I mean, not the thousands of SourceForge projects that nobody cares about. I mean, the idea of doing business around it, and it basically failed. Yeah,
so it's not nice to mention companies that have failed, but on the other hand, if it's public, anyway, I can only think, unfortunately, for Germans, perhaps high-profile example, I don't know, MindQuery got their funding cut or didn't get the next round of funding. That was a German company around collaboration software. I can't think of big-time failures right now. I'm pretty sure there are. I'm just not thinking of them right now.
Which proves the point that you typically only hear about the successful things.
Yeah. Well, some flame out. I mean, we all remember Webvan, I guess, and the sock puppet for pet food. But
I don't know that stuff.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So maybe that's Silicon Valley lore. No. Webvan was the grocer, so convenient, who would deliver for a cheap price to your door all the groceries you would want, like 300 million. But they just burned through that cash, and that was that.
And now Amazon does it.
Now Amazon does it very cautiously because of the Webvan experience, I'm sure.
So we're getting towards the end of this thing. You mentioned before patents. How does that go together with open source? Do you think this whole software pattern... I'm so in this patterns thing. Do you think this software patents thing is a threat to open source?
It's a threat. It is a threat to commercial open source companies. And that is because if you provide your software in source code form, it's much easier to see whether you're infringing on someone else's patents.
In this way.
So that is a good reason why companies may not necessarily want to open source, in particular if they think they're actually infringing, but it's not been noticed yet.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to go down the whole rat hole of software patents.
Yeah.
Obviously, the industry is not in a good shape, and there are way too many really bad software patents.
Yeah.
In the end, I don't think, though, that it will stop open source, really. So patents and open source, it's a problem if you're infringing because open source makes it more explicit.
Yep.
Patents can be used as a tool when you open source because as you provide source code and with a license that maybe doesn't cover all the bases, you can have intellectual property in your source code that most notably then patents you don't actually provision for in your license. So theoretically you could screw your community and could go back to companies who are using your software and point out that they are actually using the software for free, but maybe they want to use the commercial license because, well, lo and behold, they're infringing on some of your patents by using that software. There are other things that I don't think it really works that way because you do not want to annoy your customers that badly. There's some cases where other intellectual property, like trademarks, have been used. So I believe I hear the story in different forms from different people. From the Debian folks, I hear that the Mozilla Foundation just didn't want them to use Firefox and Thunderbird, so it's got different names and a Debian distribution gets recompiled and has different names. The Mozilla Foundation, I forgot, they told me a different story. So that was perhaps just a coincidence. Theoretically, you can use trademarks to keep your software users in check. But I don't think any of this really works well. I mean, it's just annoying your customers.
Yeah. After all, they're free to use their stuff, your stuff. I mean, they don't have to.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, the point is if you come afterwards, the point is they're already using it, you dig in.
Okay.
So you can lock in companies with open source.
Okay. So, anything else I forgot to ask? Anything else you want to, pearls of wisdom you want to leave our listeners with?
Pearls of wisdom.
Or something, whatever.
Well, in terms of open source, I mentioned this rather amazing result we got around the total growth, the exponential growth. You can actually read up on the paper we wrote on that topic and on my website.
We'll put it in the show notes, I guess.
Excellent, thank you. The website is www.riehle.org, RIEHLE.org. We did some investigation around agile method practices in open source because SAP wanted to know what skills its developers need to have in order to be effective contributors to open source. And because you can't go out there and buy training for open source because, again, every process is different and there aren't actually, I don't know of any service.
So what are those skills? I guess communication is probably, since you mentioned it, I had to ask. I guess being able to communicate with others and being just a good team player, right?
Yes. So definitely social skills figure at the top of things. Because it's also much more distributed than before. Writing skills, written skills are important because a good open source project that attracts volunteers and what have you, in some form documents its process, documents how the key design decisions are made. A common practice is someone asks a question and back comes a link to some summary email on the developer or whatever mailing list, which settled the issue 2 years ago. It is interesting to reflect on the changes that open source means for developers and developer careers. So there literally is a new form of career independent of your employer. Very simple forms. You can proceed through the stages of being a user of some open source software, becoming a developer when, say, you provide your first bug fix, to becoming a committer, meaning you have rights to the code repository. In larger projects, developers do not have automatic rights, but rather whatever code they write gets submitted to the
gurus.
A patch or to some mailing list and is picked up by a committer, and only the committer actually checks it in.
Yeah, sure.
So committers are powerful positions in open source projects, and they actually give you some independence of your employer because it's valued by other employers that you are a committer in open source projects, most notably for the professional service firms you mentioned.
Right.
That can get you another job easier. Also, what we observe is that by working in open source projects, you publicly document your competence. So if you are contributing something and it gets accepted into the code base, then you can just point to the check-in or the commit and or in some other form show a potential employer here. I've contributed to this project. It was deemed good quality and was accepted. I interview a lot for jobs that we have at SAP. So whenever someone tells me he's writing open source code, I ask him, send me some samples, send me some, show me the code. Very good. Exactly. That's it. Yeah. It's, Eric Gamma calls it like getting your stripes on the uniform.
Yeah. Right, yeah. This is actually another way of professional open source for the individual developer.
It makes life definitely more interesting for software developers.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess we're at the end. Thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate this discussion, although it's not necessarily a typical topic for SE Radio, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun, and I'm sure this is a topic where we can have more discussions.
Sure, anytime.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Hallo,
hier sind Bernd Österreich
und Christian Weiß von der Firma OSE aus Hamburg.
Wir suchen zur Festanstellung J2E-Entwickler mit exzellenten Architektur- und Java-Erfahrungen.
Als Coach und Trainer bringst du unseren Kunden bei, systematisch bessere Software zu entwickeln.
Wer arbeitet denn hier sonst so?
Ja, lauter schräge Vögel natürlich. Also ich würde sagen, bei der OSE arbeiten eine ganze Menge sehr qualifizierter Leute, die wirklich in verschiedensten Bereichen ziemliches an Expertise mitbringen im Laufe der Jahre, sowohl im technischen Bereich wie auch Projektmanagement und so natürlich Modellierungsfragen.
Ganz viele tolle Kollegen, die hier bei mir arbeiten. Das Spannende ist, dass sie wirklich sehr, sehr unterschiedliche Stärken haben, sehr unterschiedliche Bereiche unterwegs sind und man eigentlich immer jemanden findet, der Thema X als der Experte bedient.
Also ich habe das Glück, hier direkt mit Tim Wilkins am Schreibtisch zu sitzen, den ich natürlich vorher schon kannte. Das ist überhaupt hier ein großer Vorteil bei OSE, ist mit einer Menge namhafter Kollegen zusammen. Und ich wundere mich immer, dass ich dafür auch noch bezahlt werde, hier Informationen aus erster Hand zu bekommen.
Wie sollen denn neue Kollegen oder Kolleginnen sein?
Die sollen vor allem offen sein, neuen Ideen gegenüber natürlich.
Offen, kompetent, gewillt, auch im Team zu arbeiten, keine Einzelkämpfer.
Eine Offenheit, sich auf Ungewöhnliches einzulassen und andererseits aber auch etwas gestandenem Wissen und Erfahrung, die man einfach mitbringt und hier einbinden kann.
Ich sehe das hier so ein bisschen wie so ein Wissensbasar. Ne? Da wäre es für mich schon interessant, wenn die Leute irgendwas gut können, aber auf der anderen Seite halt eben auch sehr neugierig sind, sich neue Sachen anzugucken. Gerade auch, wir müssen uns ja auch immer weiterentwickeln, neue Themen tauchen auf, wo keiner Erfahrung mit hat, solche Sachen gemeinsam auszuprobieren. Also
wir freuen uns auf deine Bewerbung.
Schau mal rein unter www.ose.de
mit Doppel-O
oder schaue im Sing unter Christian Weiß
mit Doppel-S.
Thanks for listening to Software Engineering Radio. If you want more information about the podcast and all the other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. If you want to support us, you can donate to the SE Radio team via the website, or you can advertise for SE Radio, for example, by clicking on the Dig, Reddit, Delicious and Slashdot buttons. To contact the team, please send email to team@seradio.net, or if it's specific to an episode, please use the comments facility on the website so other people can read and react to your comments. This episode of Software Engineering Radio, as well as all other episodes, are licensed under a Creative Commons license. Please see the website for details. Thanks to Charlie Crow and the Podsafe Music Network for the music used in this show. The song is called Vegas Hard Rock Shuffle.